the year 130 AD, the most powerful man on earth woke up in the dark, dressed in silence, and walked out to the west bank of the Nile to wait for the sunrise. He was Hadrian, Emperor of Rome, ruler of an empire that stretched from the cold walls of northern Britain to the deserts of Arabia. He commanded legions, he built cities, kings begged for his attention, and he had crossed the Mediterranean Sea, sailed up the Nile, and traveled to a dusty plain outside the ancient city of Thebes to stand in front of a broken statue and wait for it to speak to him. We know this happened. This is not a myth, because a poet in his court, a woman named Julia Balbilla, carved a record of that morning directly into the statue's leg, and her words are still there today, cut into the stone, surrounded by more than 100 other ancient messages in Greek and Latin. Emperors, governors, ordinary travelers, century after century, they all came to this exact spot, before dawn, for the same reason. Because for roughly 200 years, this statue, 18 meters tall, carved from a single block of stone, weighing 720 tons, made a sound as the sun came up. The ancient world called it singing. And here is the detail that has fascinated historians for 2,000 years. This statue stood in complete silence for 14 centuries after it was built. It only began to sing after an earthquake broke it nearly in half. And on the day the Romans finally repaired it, the voice stopped. And in 1800 years, it has never been heard again. To understand how a block of stone learned to speak, and how an empire accidentally silenced it, you have to start with the man who ordered it carved, a pharaoh who ruled Egypt at the absolute height of its power. His name was Amenhotep III, and in the 14th century BC, he had a problem very few rulers in history have ever had. Egypt was so wealthy, so secure, and so dominant that there were no wars left worth fighting. Gold flowed in from Nubia. Tribute arrived from every direction. So Amenhotep spent his reign doing what unchallenged kings do. He built. And on the west bank of the Nile, across the river from Thebes, he ordered the largest temple complex Egypt had ever seen, his mortuary temple, a place the Egyptians called a house of millions of years. It covered more ground than the great temple of Karnak, and at its entrance, facing the rising sun, he placed two colossal statues of himself, seated, hands resting on his knees, his mother and his wife, carved small beside his legs, twin giants standing guard over eternity. Here is what happened to that eternity. The temple is gone, floods undermined it, earthquakes shook it down. Later pharaohs carried away its stone, block by block, to build their own monuments. Today, of the largest temple complex in Theban history, almost nothing remains above the ground. Except the two giants. The guards outlived the thing they were guarding by more than 3,000 years. And the question of how those guards got there in the first place is where this story takes its first strange turn. Each statue is carved from a single block of quartzite, not assembled from pieces, one solid mass of stone, roughly 720 tons. To feel that number, picture the largest passenger aircraft ever built, an Airbus A380, fully loaded with fuel and passengers. That is about 570 tons. Each of these statues weighs more than that, with another 150 tons to spare. And quartzite is not a forgiving material. It is one of the hardest stones the Egyptians ever attempted to carve, far harder than the limestone and sandstone of their everyday monuments. Now here is the detail that separates these statues from almost every other megalith in Egypt. The stone did not come from Thebes. It came from a quarry called Gebel El Ahmar, the Red Mountain, near what is now Cairo, 675 kilometers away. And Egypt's Great Highway, the river that carried obelisks and temple blocks up and down the country for 3,000 years, was of no use here. Because the Nile flows north. Thebes lies south of the quarry, upstream, against the current. And scholars believe blocks of this size were simply too heavy to be barged upstream against the flow of the river, which leaves one conclusion, and it is the accepted one: 720 tons of stone moved overland across 675 kilometers of Egypt. Now, to be fair, the Egyptians deserve their reputation here. This was not magic, and we should not pretend it was. A wall painting in the tomb of a nobleman named Jehutihotep shows exactly how they moved colossal statues, lashed to a massive wooden sledge, hauled by long lines of men, with a worker pouring water onto the ground ahead of the runners to make the sledge glide. It worked. Egypt moved 60-ton statues this way, and 100-ton architraves and obelisks. Organized labor was the one resource the pharaohs had in unlimited supply. But hold the honest scale of this particular journey in your mind. Not 60 tons, 720. Not across a construction site. Across 675 kilometers of valley and desert margin. Twice, because there are 2 statues, every meter of ground prepared. Thousands of haulers fed and watered for months. And of this entire operation, one of the greatest feats of transport in the ancient world, not a single record survives. No inscription describes the journey. No painting shows it. We only know it happened because the statues are sitting there. And the strange part is, the journey was only the beginning. Because everything the ancient world would remember about this statue happened after it broke. In the year 27 BC, an earthquake tore through southern Egypt. Temples cracked, walls came down, and the northern Colossus, the one on the right as you face them, fractured and collapsed from the waist up. The head and torso of the pharaoh crashed to the ground, leaving a broken giant, legs and lap intact, a shattered stump above. By any normal logic, that should be the end of the statue's story. It is the moment it became a ruin. Instead, it is the moment it became famous. Because not long after the earthquake, visitors began reporting something impossible. At dawn, and only at dawn, as the first sunlight struck the broken stone, the statue made a sound. Some described it as a musical note. Others compared it to the snap of a lyre string, a short, ringing tone coming from somewhere inside the fractured rock. It did not happen every morning. Some travelers waited days and heard nothing. Others heard it once, and some claimed twice in a single sunrise. And that unpredictability made it more powerful, not less, because now, hearing the statue was an omen. If the stone sang for you, the gods were with you. The Greek geographer Strabo stood in the crowd at dawn, around 20 BC, and he heard it himself. A sound, he wrote, like a light blow. And then he added something that tells you everything about the man. He admitted he could not be certain whether the sound came from the statue itself or from someone in the crowd playing a trick. He was a skeptic, standing at the foot of a miracle, being honest about the limits of what he knew. 2,000 years later, that is still the correct attitude, and we will come back to it. But the crowds were not skeptics. Greek visitors looked at the broken giant greeting the sunrise and gave it a name from their own oldest stories: Memnon, the hero of the Trojan War, killed by Achilles, the son of Eos, goddess of the dawn. In their eyes, the statue was Memnon himself, crying out each morning to greet his mother as she rose into the sky. Her tears, they said, were the morning dew on the stone. Remember that detail. The dew. It sounds like pure poetry. It may be the key to everything. For the next 2 centuries, this broken statue was one of the most famous attractions on Earth. Pilgrims sailed up the Nile for it. Roman governors made the detour. Poets carved verses into its legs. Over 100 inscriptions in Greek and Latin, still readable today. An ancient visitor's book written in stone. And in the year 130 AD, The Emperor Hadrian himself stood before it in the dark, with his wife and his court, waiting for the voice of Memnon. Then, around the end of that century, another emperor arrived, and he decided to do the statue a favor. It turned out to be the most expensive favor in history. Septimius Severus was a soldier emperor, a hard, practical man who had fought his way to the throne. Around the year 199 AD, he came to see the singing statue, and according to the accounts that survive, the statue did not sing for him. The oracle stayed silent for the master of the Roman world. What Severus did next was, by every ancient standard, an act of respect. He ordered the broken Colossus rebuilt. Workers raised new courses of sandstone blocks, you can still see them today, stacked in visibly different layers on top of the original quartzite legs, and they closed the great fracture that the earthquake had opened 2 centuries before. Perhaps he hoped the restored god would finally speak to him. Perhaps he simply believed a broken monument dishonored a divine king. The statue never made another sound. The last reliable record of the voice of Memnon dates to the year 196 AD, just before the repair. After the new stones went up, silence. The dawn crowds thinned, the pilgrimage ended, and within a few generations the most famous sound in the ancient world existed only in the inscriptions on the statue's legs. Rome had repaired the statue's body and killed its voice, and no one has heard it since. So what was it? What did Hadrian actually hear that morning? To be fair, the mainstream explanation deserves a full hearing here, because it is a good one. Physicists and Egyptologists point to the crack itself. During the cold desert night, moisture, dew, seeped into the fractured stone. At dawn, the first sunlight heated the broken surfaces rapidly. The trapped moisture evaporated, the air inside the fissures expanded, and it forced its way out through the narrow cracks, producing a short, resonant note, a natural whistle, built by an earthquake, played by the sun. And notice how much this explanation gets right. It explains why the statue only sang at dawn. That is when the temperature swing is sharpest. It explains why it never sang before the earthquake. There was no crack. It explains why it was unpredictable. The sound depended on humidity and heat lining up just so. And it explains, perfectly, why the singing stopped the moment Severus sealed the fracture. Even the Greek myth had quietly recorded the mechanism: the tears of the dawn goddess, the morning dew on the stone. The poetry and the physics were describing the same thing. But here is the honest limit, and it matters. This explanation has never been tested, because it cannot be. The crack is gone. The one instrument on Earth that could confirm the theory was dismantled in 199 AD by the very empire that worshipped it. The voice of Memnon is a described phenomenon, witnessed by emperors and geographers and carved into stone by 100 hands. But it was never measured, and now it never can be. The explanation fits beautifully. Proving it is impossible. That is where the mystery still lives. Step back now and look at what this story actually is. For centuries, the singing statue was filed away as a legend, one more charming ancient tale, like talking oaks and weeping icons. But the ancients were not telling us a fantasy. They were reporting an observation, a real, physical, repeating phenomenon, witnessed at dawn over 200 years, by some of the most credible eyewitnesses antiquity ever produced. They wrapped it in the story of Memnon and his mother, because myth was the language they had. Underneath the myth, the report was accurate. The stone made a sound. The account was early, not wrong. And there is one more thought worth sitting with. We usually imagine ancient mysteries being lost to time, buried by sand, toppled by earthquakes, burned in libraries. This one was lost to good intentions. An emperor looked at a broken, singing wonder and chose the body over the voice. He could not have known he was making that trade. But every sunrise since the year 149 has been silent, and the only reason we know what the world lost is that the people who heard it could not stop themselves from carving it into the statue's legs. The giants are still there. They have watched roughly 1.25 million sunrises since the last note, and the repair that silenced the northern Colossus is still visible from the road. Pale sandstone blocks stacked on dark quartzite legs, the scar of the most expensive favor in history. So here is my question for you, and I genuinely want to know where you land. If you had been standing in Severus's place, knowing what you know now, would you have repaired the statue? Would you trade its voice for its body? Or leave the pharaoh broken and singing forever? Tell me your answer in the comments, and tell me why. And if this is the kind of history you stay up for, the documented kind, the kind that turns out to be stranger than the legends, subscribe and turn on the bell. Because the next mystery is a set of stone boxes buried beneath the Egyptian desert, so precisely made that modern engineers still argue about them. Until then, sleep well, and keep one eye on the legends. They have a better record than we were told.